Okay, welcome everyone this afternoon. I am so glad you could make it. I know it's a very busy time at the end of the semester, but this program is definitely worth carving out some time on your schedule for. So I am Rebecca Lubas, Dean of the Libraries here at CSUSB. And I have the great pleasure today of introducing our panel to talk about By the Shores of Lake Michigan, Recovering World War II Prison Camp and Resettlement Stories Through Poetry. And I love the convergence of history and poetry there. And I also, before I introduce our very distinguished speakers, I also wanted to be sure to thank the folks who have helped us put on this program. Robbie Madrigal from the libraries over here, wave Robbie, and Robbie will also be assisting with the book giveaway because we have copies of the book to give away after the program is over. And I also want to thank the Faculty Center for Excellence for sharing their space with us and the technical support. And thanks to those of us, Robbie, who today provided the IT support for us? Finley. So thank you very much. Very much appreciate all that help and support. So I am going to read some extremely, while they're brief, they're extremely impressive biographies of our very distinguished scholars here today. So Mariko Aratani was born in Nagoya, Japan. She is a Japanese instructor, translator, and editor. A graduate of Tokyo Gaijutsu University of Fine Arts and Music and the University of Wisconsin and Japanese literature and Japanese pedagogy. She recently retired from teaching Japanese at Fordham University. Her publications include The Ink Dark Moon, the English language translation of poems by two women in the Heian area court, and The White Flash, Black Rain, a collection of poems and articles by women victims of the atomic bomb. And I also have to say that these biographies are also like giving me a wish list of things we have to get for the library. So Nancy Matsumoto is a third-generation Japanese-American writer and editor who is based in Toronto. She studies about food and drink, agriculture, Japanese-American culture, art and history, and the environment. In addition to By the Shore of Lake Michigan, books she has written or contributed to include the James Beard Award-winning Exploring the World of Japanese Craft Sake, Rice Water Earth, Unforgotten Voices from the Heart Mountain, An Oral History of the Incarceration, The New Traditional, Displaced, Manzanar 1942 to 1945, The Incarceration of Japanese Americans, and Race, Tales, and Flight. Her forthcoming book is titled Reaping What She Sows, How Women Are Rebuilding Our Broken Food System. So also you can see the wonderful interdisciplinary connections from our scholars here. So Yuri Yasuhara immigrated from the US with her family when she was a child. She studied the Japanese language, literature, and history at UCLA, where she received her PhD in 1982. As a graduate student, she participated in the Japanese American Research Project and authored the literature section of the project's annotated bibliography, A Buried Past. Her areas of interest are 18th century Japanese haiku. She has published articles in the Lemon Notebooks, a haiku journal published in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And she was professor of Japanese at Cal State University, Los Angeles, and retired in 2013 as dean of our very own College of Arts and Letters right here at CSUSB. And our fourth speaker, Kyoko Miyabi, was born in Yokohama, Japan, and received her PhD in English literature at Cambridge University. She is chair of Humanities and Science Department at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Her publications include Henry James and John Singer Sargent, Staging the Drama, Framing the Beholder, Elizabeth Bishop and the Poets of Escape, As a practicing artist, she has exhibited in galleries and art institutes in New York and Philadelphia, including Cerulean Arts, Woodmere Art Museum, Stevenson's Library at Bard College, New York Hall of Science, and at the University of Pennsylvania. A selection of her pen and ink drawings was published in Celia Bland's collection of poetry, Cherokee Roadkill, in 2018. So one more round of applause, please. So I am really looking forward to this talk, and I will turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank the Fowle Library and the Dean of Library, Rebecca Lubas, for sponsoring our talk, the beautiful introduction, and the Asian Faculty, Staff, and Student Association for co-sponsoring us, as well as Robbie Madrigal for all his help in taking care of the many details involved in making this talk possible, and Finn for his tech help. We are all very honored to be here today. We're here to present our recently published book, By the Shore of Lake Michigan. It's a collection of tanka poetry written by my Issei, first-generation grandparents Tomiko and Ryokuyō Matsumoto between 1943 and 1959, and published in 1960. We're especially grateful for the opportunity to discuss our book in this moment when the civil liberties and livelihoods of many immigrants and American citizens are once again under assault, and the rule of law itself is being tested daily. Recounting my own immigrant family's stories of unjust marginalization and incarceration will, I hope, serve as a call to action, to dissent, and to advocate for those whose civil rights are being threatened in our country today. By the Shore of Lake Michigan begins after the February 1942 signing of Executive Order 9066, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt's justification for ordering the West Coast roundup and incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese descent. To draw another parallel with what happened in 1942 and what's happening now, it's worth noting that FDR acted under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, the same piece of legislation that Donald Trump invoked last month to authorize the sudden deportation of hundreds of Venezuelan immigrants. In my brief segment, I would like to tell you a little bit about my grandparents and their history. Mariko will discuss the classic 5-line tanka poetry form, and Eri will talk about the Matsumoto's evolving self-identity. Kyoko will finish our talk with a look at the Matsumoto's poetry writing as a means of creating meaning and purpose during the most difficult period of their lives. My grandfather, Gennosuke Ryokuyō, was a pen name, arrived in America in 1917, transferred to Seattle, Washington by his company in Japan. Since our team has become accustomed to calling him by his pen name, I will use that in our presentation. In Seattle, Ryokuyō met my great-uncle Taisuke, and they bonded over sharing the same home prefecture of Chiba. Taisuke thought Ryokuyō would be a really good match for his younger sister Tomiko, so Tomiko and Ryokuyō began a correspondence between Japan and the United States. And then in 1921, Ryokuyō went back to Japan to marry Tomiko and bring her and her mother Iku to America. My grandparents shared a love for literature. On his first Pacific crossing, Ryokuyō packed in his single wicker suitcase a book by the tanka poet Ishikawa Takuboku. It was, as he wrote later, his only company on the long Pacific crossing. And the timing of Tomiko and her mother's arrival in America was good because it was shortly before the passage of the Asian Exclusion Act of 1924, which halted all Asian immigration into the US. So my grandparents ran a fruit stand and a soda fountain in Pike's Place Market, and their 3 children, including my mother, were all born in Seattle. When the Great Depression of 1929 arrived, the Matsumoto's bank in Seattle failed. Then in 1933, they decided to move to the bigger city of Los Angeles, which had more opportunity, and Tomiko's brother, Taisuke, had already settled there. So in Los Angeles, they ran a small business, a grocery store near Los Angeles City Hall, in an increasingly hostile and anti-Japanese environment leading up to the outbreak of World War II. Following the signing of Executive Order 9066, the Matsumotos were forcibly removed, along with 18,000 others, to the Santa Anita Racetrack Assembly Center. Months later, in the summer of 1943, they boarded a train guarded by bayonet-wielding soldiers and traveled to Heart Mountain, where they were among 10,000 people held in captivity. In the photo, you'll see my mother on the left, Sumi. She was 10 when she went into the prison and in elementary school. My Auntie Terry, or Teruko, in the middle, was 16, and she was in high school. Next to her is my grandmother Tomiko, who was age 43 at the time. And on the right, you'll see my uncle Tosh, or Toshio, who was 18 and a freshman at UCLA. For my mother, but I think especially for her siblings, I believe the trauma of being pulled out of what should have been the most exciting and fun times of their lives was repressed for many years. When he was in his 90s, I sent my Uncle Tosh part of this book in manuscript form. And he told me that while reading it, suddenly he understood how much emotional stress his parents had been under at the time. And he said, and wrote to me in an email, spontaneously, tears began to flow out of my eyes. It was amazing. At Heart Mountain, Tomiko captured the chaos, dislocation, and desolation the inmates felt in the anthology's first poem. And it reads, "In the midst of swirling dust, I live temporarily in this barren land during wartime." But Heart Mountain was also a place filled with experts in many different disciplines. And very soon after the prisoners arrived, classes and clubs began with experts to lead them in everything from flower arranging to judo to, of course, poetry writing. Tomiko learned that a tanka club was forming in the prison camp, and she cajoled her husband to attending meetings with her. And of that fateful day and meeting, she wrote, "A glimpse at a poetry salon became my destiny. Now, even on days of blizzard, I won't miss a poetry meeting." Before we started on this translation project, my mother had told me that By the Shore was a vanity publication her parents had undertaken on their own, meaning that they just funded it themselves. So it was shocking to learn that, in fact, this book was part of a 300-volume series spanning the 90-year existence of the Utato Kanjo Poetry Society, of which my grandmother was a member. And the editor of this poetry society, Utato Kanjo, shared these photos. On the left, you'll see the bookshelf in the society's Tokyo office containing the entire series. And on the right is a close-up of my grandparents' book in the lineup. It's circle number 36. And so what I realized is that far from being a vanity project, Tomiko had been invited to contribute to this series, a great honor. My discovery was a powerful reminder of how little the Issei generation, that is the second generation of my parents, separated from their parents by language and often by differing national loyalties, knew about their Issei parents' activities and their inner lives. This misunderstanding only deepened during the resettlement period. The Issei did not fully appreciate how hard it was for the Japanese-born Issei to start life anew in Chicago. Unlike their children, they were not native English speakers. Many had been incarcerated when they were in the prime of their lives, robbed of the livelihoods they had spent decades building. Others were reaching the end of their working lives. In Chicago, Ryokuyō found work in the shipping department of McClurg's, a book wholesaler and one of several places known to be open to hiring resettled Japanese. Tomiko, meanwhile, began working in a sewing factory. Despite the federal government's attempts to steer resettlers to Chicago, which everyone viewed as a more tolerant city than West Coast cities, what they found is that it was fairly racially polarized. They had to carefully navigate a working world that the historian Charlotte Brooks has called an in-between position between white owners and managers on one side and a swelling African-American working class on the other. And they experienced different levels of racism that sometimes put them in alliance with other minority groups, but sometimes also in competition with other minority groups. Instead of broaching the painful topic of racism, Ryokuyō wrote about the day-to-day pleasures and challenges of life in Chicago. And in the interest of time, I won't read all of these, but he did devote 4 poems to the Great Coal Strike of 1946, for example, which crippled the city. But he also wrote about excursions to Jackson Park and picnics by the lakeside. So a real glimpse into what daily life was like. The newly arrived Japanese were also subject to redlining. They were kept out of all white neighborhoods, along with the city's Black and Jewish populations. Historian Brooks writes that they, quote, often found apartments in tense neighborhoods, settling in transition zones that defined their in-betweenness in physical terms, end quote. One of the transition zones open to the Japanese was the Oakland Kenwood neighborhood on the south side. There, in 1948, the Matsumotos purchased a house on Lake Park Avenue. Tomiko, worried the house was beyond their means, supplemented their income by providing room and board to young Issei men attending the University of Chicago. Used to the cramped quarters that she had lived in the prison, and then for their first basement apartment in Chicago, she was awed by the size of this apartment. Although the resettlement period was a very busy one for the Matsumotos, they continued to write poetry daily. In 1955, one of Tomiko's poems was selected for the Emperor's annual poetry party ceremony, known as the Utakai Hajime. And the family attended a reception in honor of Tomiko at the home of the Japanese Consul General in Chicago. By the end of their stay in Chicago, both Matsumotos were connected to different Japanese poetry societies, Utato Kansho for Tomiko and Araragi for Ryokuyō. They wrote poems about their children, vacations in Wisconsin, and sometimes about the joy of writing poetry itself. In one of these poems, Tomiko wrote, "Since joining Utato Kansho, once again, my passion for poetry burns anew, my writer's spirit." So here I'd like to end my segment and introduce one of my 2 wonderful translator colleagues, Mariko Aratani.
Thank you for inviting us today, and thank you for coming. I'm talking about tanka and then Japanese identity. Tanka, also called waka in the pre-modern period, is the oldest form of Japanese poetry that has been written for over 1,300 years, and it is still an enthusiastically practiced genre today. Traditionally, a tanka is a single, untitled vertical line consisting of 5 units with a syllable pattern of 5-7-5-7-7. And here's an example. I just read to show the syllable pattern. 吹きまくるサビン浴びつつ高原に カリスムしばし、戦時さなかを. In the Heian period, it was a key mode of communication among the aristocracy, especially in romantic exchanges. A well-crafted tanka could be the difference between winning or losing someone's affections. Writing a tanka sometimes required certain literary conventions and the knowledge of old tanka poems. Haiku, which is even shorter with only 3 lines, often focuses on nature and the changes of seasons and emotions evoked by those. In contrast, tanka has always embraced a wide range of themes: love, and personal emotions, political struggles, and even historical events, which Ryokuyō wrote about a lot. It's a poetic form that allows for deep personal expression, making it particularly a suitable and significant outlet for Tomiko and Ryokuyō to directly express their emotions in times of hardship or change in the camp's harsh, desolate environment with hardly any diverse nature or delicate seasonal changes. By the late 19th century, during the Meiji era, tanka underwent a transformation, eclipsing the image of old elegant tanka style. A freer and more individual tanka style emerged. Soon, a very famous tanka journal, Myojo, was published and popularized this modern tanka without any rule except 57577 syllable format. One of the poets published in Myojo was Ishikawa Takuboku, whose poetry book was the one Ryokuyō brought to America with him. Since then, many tanka associations were founded. Tomiko belonged to Utato Kansho, and Ryokuyō belonged to Araragi, both well-established tanka associations led by the highest masters around that time. As mentioned, By the Shore of Lake Michigan was published as one of the tanka series by Utato Kansho in 1960. Over time, tanka writing as well as haiku writing became national pastime activities. Today, tanka is practiced at many levels, from casual writers to master poets. However, it is really remarkable that so many people at the national level in Japan are engaged in not only reading, but writing tanka or haiku poems. Nowadays, the tanka population is estimated to be 500,000. The haiku population is a stunning 6 million. All kinds of newspapers and magazines have a column of tanka and haiku, selected from numerous submitted poems every week, in addition to individual postings on social media. There are very popular TV and radio programs dedicated to these poems, and there are about 30 annual literary hours and tanka and about 50 for haiku. Also, there is an annual poetry ceremony in January at the Emperor's Palace to which anyone can submit. This year, for example, there were 10 tanka selected and read among about 16,000 submissions. As Nancy mentioned, in 1955, one of Tomiko's tanka was selected for this prestigious event, an honor she described as one of the highlights of her life. So, why does tanka hold such a deep place in Japanese culture? There are 2 key reasons: rhythm and brevity. For some reason, the rhythm of the combination of 5 and 7 syllables sounds so pleasant, natural, expressive to Japanese people's ears, as if they are the heartbeat. In Japanese, each syllable has the same length, unlike English. For example, in English, words like the and street have 1 syllable each, but the length of each syllable is very different. On the other hand, in Japanese, phrases such as sora to yama and then itsu mite mo have 5 syllables each and have exactly same length and rhythmic patterns. Thus, it is no problem to distinguish 5 and 7 syllables. This tanka format of 57577 was already established in the oldest extant poetry collection called the Manyoshu, completed in the mid-8th century. The Manyoshu comprises more than 4,500 tanka poems written by people of various statuses, such as emperors, aristocrats, soldiers, street performers, peasants, and ordinary people. It seems tanka had been already established by then as a national literary activity among the whole general population. This tradition has been continuing until now. 5 and 7 syllable words and phrases are embedded even in everyday life, not just in poetry, but in posters, advertisements, slogans, song lyrics, etc. For Japanese people, the combination of 5 and 7 syllables is easy to absorb and remember and is impactful. They feel tanka at an almost instinctive, innate, visceral level. The second reason for the fascination with tanka and also haiku is the short form. The short form is deceptively simple. While it may seem easy to write just 31 syllables, crafting a truly great tanka takes a lifetime of practice. It requires the poet to balance constraint and freedom, to fit deep emotions and meaning into a few short lines. For many, this pursuit is a lifelong artistic passion, just like for Tomiko and Ryokuyō. Growing up in Japan until young adulthood, studying tanka and haiku since elementary school, reading and expressing themselves through these poetic forms, and being surrounded by the rhythm of 5-7 and 7-5 syllables in their everyday lives, this rhythm must have remained deeply ingrained in Tomiko and Ryokuyō's senses for the rest of their lives. While being incarcerated in the camp, stripped of their freedom and facing uncertainty, they turned to tanka to express their emotions and preserve their cultural identity. In the barren environment with little connection to the changing seasons or natural beauty, they found solace in the 31 syllables that had shaped their lives. Even after the war, their dedication to tanka continued in Chicago, where they rebuilt their lives. Ryokuyō later said in one of his tanka that he no longer felt like he was living in a foreign country. Through poetry, Tomiko and Ryokuyō not only maintained their Japanese heritage, but also created a bridge between Japan and their new Japanese American identity. Tanka is more than just poetry. It's a rhythm, a tradition, and a powerful means of self-expression. Whether written in an imperial palace, a bustling city, or a prison camp, tanka has remained a constant thread in Japanese life for over a millennium. Its ability to capture both personal and collective identity is what makes it so enduring. So that you can hear the 5-7-5-7-7 rhythm of the Matsumoto's tanka. I'm going to end my talk by quoting in English and Japanese, one tanka by Tomiko and one by Ryokuyō each, written in the camp. Tomiko. The freshness of morning in the highland seeps into my body, the joy of brushing my hair, feeling refreshed. 高原の朝のすがしさ、身にしみて、髪爽やかに透ける嬉しさ。Ryokuyō. In the midst of war, along with our countrymen, there might come a day when we leave the camp. How poignant that moment will be. 戦時さなか、同胞こぞりセンターを、いずる日あらん、哀れその時。Thank you very much. Now I would like to introduce next speaker, Eri Yasuhara.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for allowing us to share with you our various readings of this book. And before I get started, I do want to echo Nancy's gratitude to Dean Rebecca Lubas of the library. I think it was December when I first asked for an appointment to see you to sell this, and she really welcomed us with open arms. So I'm really grateful. I want to thank Thin. Is he still here? Oh, no. What happened to him? Anyway, he was going to babysit us, maybe. Anyway, so I want to thank him for that. And I really want to thank Robbie Madrigal. I think you probably must have gotten sick and tired of getting emails from me, because every time it would like every other day, it's, oh, I forgot to ask you about this and this, and oh, what about that? So I do want to thank you. Okay, so as Nancy noted earlier, there is at present a dearth of English language material that might tell us more about the inner lives, the thoughts and feelings of the Issei, that first generation of Japanese immigrants who, through enormous effort and hardship, paved the way for the rest of us Japanese Americans. We know in broad strokes what they did as immigrants. We also know all too well what was done to them. But because the Issei who did express their thoughts and feelings did so in Japanese, their English-only speaking descendants and the wider English-speaking world have not had access to their myriad stories. But when even one work is translated into English, as in the case of By the Shore of Lake Michigan, we unlock a whole new world of stories. Indeed, there are many narrative threads that might be unraveled in this one collection, threads or themes or frameworks that can help us understand not just what the Issei went through, but how they felt about it. One of these threads is the evolution of their self-identity as expressed in their poems. From foreigners and enemy aliens during the war to something new in their later years. Japanese American citizens of the United States, an identity that encompassed both their Japanese heritage and their commitment to America as their home. This particular theme has been of personal and professional interest to me for some time now, and I was pleased to find that it can work as one framing device to help us understand and appreciate this collection. Because the Matsumotos began studying and composing tanka at Heart Mountain in 1943, we have no poems telling us how they felt about being Japanese immigrants living in Los Angeles before that. But I think we can make a well-educated guess. If asked, they probably would have identified themselves as Nihonjin, Japanese, who had immigrated with the intent of settling here, just living their daily lives and raising a family in America, like millions of other immigrants before them and after. The war and incarceration changed all that, of course. Possibly for the first time, they were made to feel acutely not only their foreignness, but especially their legal status as enemy aliens because they were treated as such. Enemy alien is, of course, a label applied by the outside world, and surely not how Tomiko and Ryokuyō self-identified. But labels are powerful, as you know, and can be insidious. This one had an enormous effect on their lives because it was one of the justifications used for their incarceration. Japan's defeat and the end of the war in the Pacific brought into stark relief the feeling of being caught between the country of their birth and the country of not just their own, but their children's future. By this time, which is August of 1945, The Matsumotos are in their new home, Chicago. Ryokuyō has given us a dozen tanka marking this occasion, poems that speak to the agony he must have felt, torn between the loyalty he naturally feels toward Japan and the Japanese people, coupled with his sense of how this defeat must be affecting his countrymen. I'm not going to read these two poems, but in at least these two poems, Ryokuyō displaces his own grief at Japan's defeat onto the people in Japan, as well as those remaining in the camps. And then there is the indescribable pain of seeing and understanding the unadulterated joy of their children upon hearing the news. Our children, my wife and I, each with different viewpoints, respond to the big news with alternating joy and sorrow. その立場、異なる子らと妻と我、大きニュースに引きこもごもに。In the end, not having anywhere to put my feelings, suddenly I stand and let tears fall. いや果てに、我の心の置きどころなくてつと立ち、涙落とせり。I found these to be some of the most moving of Ryokuyō's poems in the entire collection. This, after all, was a man who didn't often express his feelings outwardly. Time passes, and it's possible to detect in some poems a softening of the sense of foreignness that they and other Japanese had had imposed on them during the war, whether they had internalized that label or not. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act, also called the McCarran-Walter Act, passed, and for the first time it became possible for Issei to become naturalized U.S. citizens. Many Issei quickly took advantage of this opportunity, including, by the way, my own grandfather, who had also spent the war incarcerated. And both Tomiko and Ryokuyō celebrated this milestone with tanka. I'm going to read just the second one by Tomiko. In honor of the 40 years that Issei have struggled on this continent, the right of naturalization is issued today. 44年、この大陸に一世の苦闘の誉れは今日の帰化権。These tanka proudly declare that Issei have earned the right of citizenship through their decades of bitter struggle, kuto, hard work, and contributions to American society. It was a moment when their legal status and their self-identity as immigrants who had more than paid their dues merged, and they took their rightful place in American society as full-fledged American citizens of Japanese ancestry. In August of 1956, the Matsumotos embarked on an extended journey to Japan, their first visit in over 30 years. To me, one of the most notable aspects of the many poems written during their stay is the realization expressed in several of Tomiko's compositions of the distance or the gap that she now realizes exists between herself and the Japan she had known. Bewildered by a Tokyo drastically transformed, like a foreigner, I am unable to find my way alone. 東京の大き変貌に戸惑いて、一人歩けず異邦人のこと。At a corner crammed with rows of modern buildings, I stand astonished. Is this really Japan? 近代ビル並びひしめく一角に立ちて驚く。ここは日本か? The initial shock lessens as their journey progresses, but to me, this trip marks another stage in the evolution of their, especially Tomiko's, self-identity as no longer fully of Japan in the way she remembered Japan, but now also of America. Finally, there comes the realization that they are now truly rooted in America because their children's lives and happiness are here. This tanka was composed by Ryokuyō toward the end of their months-long visit. At Awa Amatsu, looking across the open sea, beyond the horizon it reaches our grandchildren and children in America. 泡余つ沖を見さくれば、水平線越えてアメリカの孫子に及ぶ。Perhaps he's a bit so homesick after 4 months or more in Japan. But if so, home, or at least what is tugging at his heart, okay, I had a momentary something happened anyway. Tugging at his heart is no longer Japan, but America, where his very American children and grandchildren are. He has completed the trajectory of his evolution from the Issei immigrant who considered himself thoroughly Japanese and who was devastated by his country's defeat, to the naturalized U.S. citizen father and grandfather of Americans, who knows where his home now is, even as he retains emotional and cultural ties to Japan. And the key to this transformation was family, his children and grandchildren. It was often said that the reason Issei were able to endure so many hardships in their lives was because they were doing it for their children, kodomo no tame ni. In the end, for Tomiko and Ryokuyō Matsumoto too, it was all about their children, their safety, security, and happiness. They endured the incarceration, Japan's defeat, the difficulties of their new life in the unfamiliar city of Chicago, all so that their children and eventually grandchildren could grow and thrive in America. How fitting then that one of their granddaughters took on the daunting task of translating their tanka, their poetic journal, so that we could get to know this Issei couple and part of their life's journey in this country. Thank you for your attention. I'd now like to turn the podium over to Kyoko Miyabe.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's a busy, one of the busiest times of the semester in the year, so thank you. In my brief talk, I like to offer a reading of a selection of the poems Tomiko Matsumoto, Nancy's grandmother, wrote during her time at the Heart Mountain prison camp and during her family's resettlement in Chicago at war's end. In particular, I like to focus on the motif of planting seeds or tending to the soil to suggest that this motif is an expression of Tomiko's resilience and resistance against all adversities. I'd like to start with this poem that appears in the first section of the book. Worrying about the unsettled sky above the summit of Heart Mountain, though our stay is temporary, we planted seeds. 定まらぬハート量の空を案じつつ、仮積みながら種子をまきたり。So I hope you can see there's a faint image of the Heart Mountain layered in the slide I created here. So this poem swiftly and dexterously evokes an image of the majestic Heart Mountain, its iconic summit high up in the gray, unsettled sky, possibly mixed with thick clouds, all seen from the perspective of Tomiko, the speaker of the poem, on the ground, worrying about the uncertain weather. Yet, we might also interpret the unsettled sky as an external manifestation of the uncertainty she feels within about life at the prison camp and beyond. These uncertainties are amplified by the temporary nature of their stay, as noted by the word karizumi, which signifies how she, like her fellow incarcerees, has been uprooted, forcefully removed from their homes. Then there are the last 7 syllables, shushi o makitari, or we planted seeds. Their meaning can be fully understood only if we keep in mind the harsh natural conditions that surrounded Tomiko and her fellow incarcerees, as she notes in this poem, the first poem that appears in the book. In the midst of swirling dust, I lived temporarily in this barren land during wartime. 吹きまくる砂塵浴びつつ高原にかりすむしばし戦時さなかを。As Professor Eri Yasuhara rightly points out in her brilliant introductory essay of the book, the Japanese original more forcefully conveys the tactile severity of the swirling dust through the first two sections of the poem in the Japanese, fukimakuru sajin abitsu. As Eri notes, quote, the suffix makuru on the verb fuki, that means blow, to blow, or as in dust swirling or blowing, has the effect of intensifying the action of the verb by adding the sense of excessively or indiscriminately or recklessly. Thus, the poem opens with a powerful image of a raging dust storm blowing indiscriminately and being felt by the speaker on her body, not just being viewed from within a shelter. Abitsu, sajin abitsu there, means while being showered by the swirling dust and sand. In considering this harsh natural condition of the prison camp, the seemingly simple act of planting seeds, I like to suggest, becomes a means of asserting agency, even a quiet resistance, in its attempt to symbolically ground oneself in this unfamiliar land, in its attempt to create life, never losing hope for a future possibility, even without any guarantee that the seeds would sprout and grow in this barren land. This motif of planting or tending to the soil reappears a few pages later in the book in these three poems written at the end of June 1944. They all refer to the fruits of what was known as Heart Mountain Miracle of 1943, when, as noted in a recent Powell Tribune post, the incarcerated laborers of the agriculture program turned a dry Wyoming desert into a verdant farmland in less than 1 year. So I'd like to read those three poems here. In the field at the camp that my compatriots have cleared, starting today, I too am a farmer. Doho no hirakishi center noen ni ware mo kyō yori noufu to narinu. We've cleared what's been called the barren land of Wyoming. Now it's become a fertile land. Wyoming no fumo no chi to zo iware shio. Warera hirakite imazo yokuya ni. Holding in hand the seedlings grown in the hothouse one by one, we transplant them to the field. Onsho ni sodachishi nae o te ni mochite, hitotsu hitotsu o chi ni utsushi yuku. These poems referencing the now fertile land of Wyoming epitomize the incarcerees' resilience and resistance on multiple levels. So first, there were the harsh natural conditions I already mentioned. There were also issues with the quality of food served at the mess hall. Heart Mountain Foundation's 2018 newsletter notes how, quote, incarcerees generously describe the fresh produce shipped from Denver as post-mature, and fresh meat was nearly unheard of. Fruit and vegetables came mostly in cans, end quote. The food situation became worse in early 1943 when, quote, fear-mongering politicians and newspaper editors around the nation began to spread rumors that Japanese Americans in the camps were not subject to wartime rationing, end quote. These rumors eventually resulted in a political representative leading a call to stop food shipments to the prison camps. To build a farm that could be self-sustaining thus became an urgent need for survival. The agricultural program was actually so successful that by the end of 1943, Heart Mountain was growing almost all of its own food. 2 years later, the camp was producing a surplus, which was sent to other prison camps. In June 1945, the Matsumotos left Heart Mountain and moved to Chicago to begin rebuilding their lives. As Nancy mentioned in her talk, Tomiko found work in a sewing factory and chronicled this fact in these two poems. They say there is still no one else of Japanese descent, yet at this workplace, I feel slightly scared. 日系人まだいぬという職場にて、我らいささかおじけ気になる。In the big company, being the first of Japanese descent, can I pave the way for others? The responsibility is heavy. この大きい会社に初めて日系人の草分けなるか、その責めや大。The courage it must have required for Tomiko to enter such a workplace in the post-war period in which anti-Japanese sentiment still pervaded is poignant. The challenging nature of the situation is even more amplified when we think about how she, like many Issei, was not wholly fluent in English. Yet, despite these hardships, the Matsumotos were able to steadily rebuild their lives. 3 years later, in 1948, they bought a house near Lake Michigan, one that seems to have included a modest backyard, where Tomiko was able to grow plants and flowers, and here the motif of planting returns. In one corner of our small garden, I plow. The flowers I intend to grow are large in number. 広からぬ庭の一隅耕して、植なん花は数多くして。And Tomiko did grow many plants and flowers, as she writes in these following poems, which impart a sense of vibrancy, reminiscent of the nurturing life brought to the barren land of Heart Mountain through Tomiko's and her fellow Japanese Americans' hard work, their resilience and resistance against adversities. So here are the two poems. The buds of myoga that we received from a friend in Oregon grow rampant and lush in the soil of Chicago. Oregon no tomo yori tabishi myoga no me, shigeri ikiyou Chicago no tsuchi ni. This morning in the neighboring garden, entwined around the lilac tree and in full bloom are morning glories. この朝け、隣の庭のリラの木に咲き盛りたり、我が家の朝顔。How the buds of myoga growing rampant and lush, or their morning glories in not only in full bloom, but growing so exuberantly that they've left the Matsumoto's garden and entwine around the lilac tree in their neighbor's garden. All this conveys a sense of vitality, as well as the beauty and joy Tomiko was able to cultivate in one corner of their small garden. Yet Tomiko's poems collected in By the Shore of Lake Michigan, which distill in words the emotions, thoughts, and experiences from her wartime incarceration to its aftermath, carry a larger resonance, extending beyond the corner of her small garden, offering us readers sustenance nearly 80 years later, just as writing poetry offered Tomiko, as she writes in the books afterward, quote, a source of strength and solace. In this current time of so many uncertainties, perhaps we can find fortitude in and learn from our ancestors' resilience and resistance against all odds, enduring hardships through acts of creation, whether through poetry, agriculture, or horticulture, never losing hope for future possibilities. Thank you very much. Now we'd like to open up to questions and answers if anyone has any.
We don't have any questions.
Oh, no question. Okay, please disregard what I just said.
Any questions for any of us? All of us, none of us? No, he said there's no questions.
Not yet. There will be those.
Sorry.
Okay.
All right.
Not
Oh, okay. All right, we were a little confused there. Okay, yes, any questions? Yes, yeah, thank you. Well, so I grew up, I'm the daughter of the authors, Tomiko and Ryokuyō, and growing up, I always saw this Japanese book on our family bookshelf, and I was very close to my grandmother and really inspired by her, started studying Japanese formally after college. And I knew enough to know that, it was kind of interesting that they published a whole book. And as a journalist and writer, I was very curious what was in it. And I had always seen my grandparents writing poetry and submitting, and it was a very big part of their life. So I just started it as a family project, like let's translate it and see what they were talking about. And so Kyoko and I were very good friends. I said, hey, do you want to collaborate on this? And we'd meet after work and just work on it. And after about 5 years, we had a draft and we presented it at the North American Tanka Society, and it was pretty well received, but there were a few little kind of tanka conventions that we didn't know about. And I don't really know what drove us to do this, but then we decided, okay, we're going to find another translator who's a professional or has done this before. And so I launched this nationwide search and was tracking Mariko across the country from San Francisco to Wisconsin to Ann Arbor. Finally called up the poet that she had collaborated with on the Ink Dark Moon, who highly recommended her. And she said, actually, she lives in Manhattan. Turns out Mariko lived 10 minutes away. And that's how she joined our team. And again, we thought this was I was told by my mother it was a vanity publication. And, it turned out to be much different. UCLA Asian American Studies Center Press accepted it. And then they said, maybe to make it more accessible, to have both a sort of a lay audience, but also academics be interested, why don't you get an academic to write the introductory essay? And how about Eri Yasuhara? This was the reviewer who suggested this. And I said, oh, that's amazing. I already interviewed Eri for my little preface to the book. I mean, this was years before, right? And so this is how our whole team formed. And it became a really wonderful adventure, and really did not expect it to be so satisfying and so incredible to learn. When you grow up with grandparents, they seem like kind of cute older people. And I think some of my cousins thought of them that way, and maybe even slightly patronizingly, like, they're old people. And then to see them really younger than I am at this age, and their struggles and what it was like to be in a prison camp was just so amazing to me. And, it really became a very profound experience. But yeah, it just started from seeing the book on the shelf in my family's house and just being curious about it. So we've given other talks where we encourage people to, find out about your grandparents, find out their stories, because one day they won't be here to tell, if they're immigrants, what that was like. And then when there's a language gap too, that makes it a lot harder. But it was really an amazing experience I think for all of us. So thank you. Yes.
Alternate.
But no, the microphone. Don't they need the microphone?
Oh, okay. I think right here. Yeah.
So the Zoom people can hear your question. Okay.
Yeah, I think right here.
Hello. I was wondering if the house by Lake Michigan is still in your family, or have you visited it?
Yes, actually in 2024, we did sort of like a roots trip to Chicago and made some wonderful connections with the Japanese American community that ended up bringing us there to talk. But we actually visited the old house, and I have pictures of it. The one that I showed here is, you can't see too much, but there is actually a article in Discover Nikkei, I believe, that talks about the old Oakland Kenwood neighborhood, and my mother's home is the lead photograph. So I have a picture of her standing in front of it. I probably should add that to the PowerPoint, but it still exists. The neighborhood, I think, has gentrified a lot. As I described, it was sort of this in-between neighborhood where people who couldn't get into, certain areas because they were Japanese or Black or Jewish, they were all in this neighborhood. And now it feels very gentrified. And but it's still standing and it's amazing. I mean, she really enjoyed going back and seeing it. Thank you. Oh, no. This is, no, I don't know who owns it, and it's probably very expensive now. So, yeah. And, they used to go to the lake and drink their coffee and go fishing, sit on the rocks and go fishing. So, very different time. Thank you.
So we do have a Zoom question. This is from Professor James Fenelon. Very beautiful. Have you thought of indigenous peoples, many of whose land the camps were on in terms of their experience?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Kyoko and I met because we both attended a screening of a film called Passing Poston. And the main point of this is how the Bureau of Indian Affairs, really were using the Japanese prisoners at the Poston camp in Arizona as free labor to put in an irrigation system for the Indian reservation right there. So this is just one example of how there were overlapping, basically exploited people who were made to either help each other out or do the work of other people as free labor. And many of the prisoners also went out and did the labor. There was a huge wartime shortage because so many people were fighting in the war. And so they were, my uncle tied railroad ties. My aunt worked in a ketchup factory, a canning factory. They did a lot of labor because they were behind barbed wire and they might as well be working and earning $16 a week or something like that. It was very paltry pay. But I do think there's a real kinship between the indigenous communities in America and what happened. I just did a whole tour of indigenous Arizona and Colorado, and I was on the Navajo and the Hopi reservations. And Mariko and I were both talking about how we felt an incredible kinship with the experience, and to be on a reservation, which is kind of like a very large, prison camp in some senses, and to see all of these people, it really resonated with me. And I think there are a lot more that could be. I brought this up with an academic as one area that I think would be really interesting to write about. And he said, yes, other people are writing about this. So I think there is, interest and scholarship going on, but it's a really interesting question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm impressed that so many of you came out during end of the semester. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience, in-person audience?
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Okay, so I admire your project. It's amazing. Well done.
Thank you.
I have a question because I'm also really interested in understanding the internment camps more. How can I use your research to understand to resist what's happening now?
It's a great question. That's why I say that little part in the beginning where I think it's such an example of, you think something's never going to happen, like your own people are going to be declared enemy aliens. 2/3 of the people who were put in these prison camps were born in America. They were American citizens. And now we see people who are legally here on a student visa or working visa just being, told if you did a social media post we don't like, we can actually deport you. So there's so many similarities, and people have remarked on that in other talks that we've given. And I'm hopeful that people will use this as sort of just more reason to get out and be an activist or use the voice that you have and the power that you have to help your people. My sister and her partner work a lot in the Latino community, and they were involved in talking to DACA kids about, okay, what do you do when ICE comes to your door? I think we all have networks that we can, access and maybe join. I'm a member of Tsuru for Solidarity, which is a civil rights group that really grew out of feeling of, okay, we had this terrible thing happen to us. How can we use our experience to help others and kind of prevent it from happening to other people? And so I'll be going to an event in Washington, D.C. in a couple weeks where we're going to lobby legislatures for reparations for African Americans, just to sort of form coalitions so that you're trying to be in allyship with other groups who are being marginalized or have been or targeted or threatened. I think it's a time when we all need to stand up and really, really try to be together and be in alliance with people who are facing things that we face, instead of saying, that's in the past. Now let's, just think about ourselves. So I think in that way, it's kind of timely for us to be publishing this book. And, people have remarked on that, but thank you for that question. I hope it helps. I'm sure there are groups here on campus that are very involved in speaking out. And yeah, it's something that would be great for all of us to do. Thank you.
Any additional questions? Okay.
Yeah, either we'll do both of you.
You had mentioned that when your family lived in Oakland, in that neighborhood, that there were other marginalized groups there, such as African Americans and Jewish people. Did your family ever make a connection with people from other marginalized groups?
Yes. I mean, I think, for instance, when my mother was in elementary school, she said by the end of elementary school, it was, they were all Blacks and Japanese. And then she went to Hyde Park High School, which is heavily Jewish. So I think she had a lot of friendships among her classmates, because those were her friends. I have a close friend in New York who's Jewish, and one of her childhood friends was Japanese, and it led her on this path to write many books about the Japanese incarceration experience. There's also a really interesting article that came out recently in The Guardian about Jackie Robinson, the famous Black baseball player. He grew up in Pasadena, Altadena. And it was Blacks and Japanese, a lot of them, and they talked about the lifelong friendship with several Japanese families and how even to this day, they're close. And so I think there were a lot of friendships like that were formed. I don't know if your family had any examples of this kind of thing. Oh, yeah.
At the same time as there were those beautiful friendships, there was also the other side, which we can't also close our eyes to, that many in the Japanese and Japanese American community simply, without question, just accepted the mainstream, I shall put assumptions concerning different peoples. Okay. Especially if they didn't know the history, for example, of African Americans, in this country, they would come from Japan and just adopt the same attitudes as those in the power structure. And I mean, I think that's not at all surprising. It's unfortunate, but it's not surprising. So there's both things.
Yeah, I think that's very true. There's a number of poems where my grandmother writes about, and my grandfather too, write about the African Americans, and I describe it in my preface as kind of a mix of fear, fascination, and admiration. In one, my grandmother's really admiring, or my grandfather's admiring the wonderful way that these African Americans are communicating and how natural and how expressive they are. And in some, there's this very sort of looking at them as exotic others. And I think, they were of their time and of their generation. So there definitely was adoption of prevalent white, views that was kind of implicit in a lot of what, and also, as I mentioned, in the workplace, there were times when they were allies and there were times when they were competing, with each other for jobs. So it was a complicated situation. But I think that there were many friendships that were formed, and it's, it's complicated.
It is complicated. Yeah.
And there was another question right here. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to say that this was a really fantastic project at contextualizing experiences firsthand. I want to start by saying I'm also Sansei. My grandfather was incarcerated at a really young age, and was there with his parents for like a period of time. And after they had left incarceration, his family had moved back to Japan. And that's where he met my grandmother, and then they immigrated to the US properly. But when they decided to immigrate to the US, there was a really large cultural divide. And I know you mentioned that there was a like feeling of homesickness when they had returned to Japan in the 50s. And in my family's experience, that kind of culture, the multiculturalism had led to the family largely cutting ties. And I just wanted to know if you had any insight on if that was maybe a common occurrence, and if so, did that kind of lead to a more self-defined Japanese American culture compared to traditional Japanese?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So the sense of nostalgia, but also a cutting of ties with Japan. And did that happen? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Pardon? Oh, yeah, I mean, I think there's a definite evolution, a lot of it, what Ari's speaking to, and I'm going to let Ari talk to this question too, because it's very much in line with her research. But yes, as she said, there's a going back and realizing, in many ways it happens to all immigrant communities, that first generation that come, their culture is sort of frozen in amber, and meanwhile their home country is moving along and developing and changing, and they are stuck in the past. So they're looked at as relics. And when they go back, they realize this, and maybe that helps that create that hybrid Japanese American identity that Ari was speaking to. So I think that it does create more feeling of maybe rootedness and realizing, well, I'm really not that Japanese anymore in the way that I thought I was, because I can't really relate to these people. I think in the worst case scenario, it might be like, I feel like I have no home. We just did a talk on Isamu Noguchi, and he was someone who felt like he just kind of didn't belong in Japan, but he also didn't belong. So that would be, and I think Ari's conception is, no, you're more than, because you're Japanese plus American. But I'm going to I was just saying, I wanted to also mention I've been admiring your sweatshirt too, but I'll let Ari speak to that.
Well, actually, you did it really well. So it's
You
really,
talk.
yeah, that I mean, the thing that Tomiko expressed in her poems, I felt like I was reading something that my mother wrote, because my mother had the exact same. She went back after like 20 years or so, and she came back and she said, "Oh, that's not, it's not Japan. I mean, I'm not Japanese anymore." There, and then not just buildings. I mean, you can imagine that the Japan that the Matsumotos left, before the war, it was vastly different in the 50s, with high-rise buildings and infrastructure, and all the material culture had changed. But my mother also said the people, and I sort of could guess, but we didn't pursue that conversation. And so I think, to me, I kind of like to see when and how things and people sort of become Japanese American, and that kind of consciousness of, oh, hey, I'm not Japanese anymore because I don't know these people. And unfortunately, there are conflicts. There were conflicts in the camps between the Issei, on the one side, their sort of a children's generation, the older Nisei, who consider themselves Americans, and of course they're the ones who volunteered and formed, the heroic 442 regimental combat group. And then there's a group in the middle that I'm a little bit interested in called the Kibei Nisei. That is Nisei who were born, so they were citizens, they were born here, but at some point in their childhood, some very young, some much older, they're sent back to Japan to to learn the language, maybe to sort of keep in touch with relatives, etc. And then they come back. Kibei means coming back to the United States. And when they went into the camps, the Kibei Nisei found themselves allied more emotionally and sort of ideologically, I suppose, with the Issei against the Nisei, against those who never went back. And so that, I think that was quite tragic. I mean, in Little Tokyo, 30 years ago or something, there was there's something called the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center in Little Tokyo, and they built a beautiful, like the Aratani Theater, I think, is there. That's your name. Yeah. But anyway, and Isamu Noguchi did some sculptures for that garden. But I remember just reading about it in the Japanese language newspaper. There was an actual sort of a fight between the Shin Issei, those who had immigrated from Japan after the war. They considered themselves the new Issei, which they were, and then the Sansei of the same age, who were the descendants, or sometimes Nisei, who were descendants of those that sort of the original Issei, Nisei, and then Sansei. And the crux of the matter seemed to be, we we have the camp, the internment experience, the incarceration experience. You don't. You don't understand us, and then sort of vice versa. And the Japanese from Japan were saying that may be true. We came later, but we're being treated the same. Okay, and to me that's sort of when people become whatever American, when they realize I know that I'm going to go way out of my comfort zone and sort of go out on a limb, but I have a very good friend who's African American, and we've had this conversation before. There have been recent, large groups of immigrants from Africa, okay, and a lot of them, I understand, don't understand the African Americans who are descended, from slavery, right, enslaved peoples. And there's sometimes conflict there. But in the end, the ones who are, I don't know, perhaps more sensitive, I don't quite know how to describe it, but they will realize that it doesn't matter if they just came 10 years ago from Africa or if their ancestors came 300 years ago, they are still being treated exactly the same in the society, and sort of, I think that's the basis of an alliance that sometimes forms, that I hope forms. So I went way out of my area of expertise.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, we have another question over here. I was going to say, it sounds like your grandfather may have been a Kibei. He went and then came back. He was here, went to Japan, and then came back. Yeah, so similar experience.
Sorry, so I don't have a question, but I just had a comment, and I found this very fascinating. So thank you so much for the wonderful talk today. One of the things that really interests me about this work and this anthology is this sort of space and time of things that's happening, and kind of thinking about how these Isseis and Niseis were able to create sort of something Japanese in a place that was very barren, that was very US, that's very much so. And so through just imagining all this through the poetry was very powerful. And the sort of notion of the ayama, that kind of in-betweenness of things that is so Japanese in essence, that's coming out through the poetry, but also through the spaces that they're inhabiting, the temporalness of these dwellings that they are living in, that's makeshifts in a sense, as well as then, just like the morning glories and rakkyo じゃなくて myoga, right? So things that are so Japanese that it's now becoming part of that kind of identity of Chicago. And so I just found that very fascinating. And so I thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, it's so true that they went into a barren camp, but what's so interesting is that you have these poetry sensei, and you have judo masters, and you have calligraphy. There's a really good book called American Sutra about the Buddhism in America and how it also went into the camps. And there was a famous Zen priest or monk at Heart Mountain. So you had, on the one hand, the Issei sort of recreating Japan, and then you had the Nisei generation acting like all American high school students with the yearbooks and the sports and the sock hops and the proms. And so you could see how this would kind of create this friction, because yes, they were recreating Japan, but then their kids were recreating, all American towns. And so, but you're right. It's just, I think what any immigrants do, they want that comfort of all of the foods and the cultural trappings of home. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We do have some Zoom questions, but a quick question. Did your grandparents know Estelle Peck Ishigo?
Yeah, I don't know if you noticed, but I used one of her watercolors
Oh,
in
really?
the
Okay.
poetry slide, and we're always trying to compact it. But yes, she was a wonderful watercolor painter who was married to. She was a European American, and her husband Arthur Ishigo was sent to Heart Mountain. And she said, "We're married. I'm going to go too." But she wonderfully documented the camp. So beautiful paintings. Another one was Mine Okubo, who wrote a book called Citizen 13360, I think. Also an incredible, early prototype of a graphic novel that tells the camp story, and it's really fantastic.
Thank
So yeah, she was there. I don't know if my grandparents knew her. I don't remember asking them.
Okay, I just want to also mention Ralph Laza was a Mexican
Yeah.
American who volunteered for incarceration at Manzanar. That's a pretty powerful story. So we have a question from Issei. In your research, were there tanka club salons and other internment camps like Manzanar, Tule Lake? When did Japanese interest in Issei written tanka begin, and where does it stand today? Is it taught, or is it mostly Japanese poetry writers who are interested?
Yeah, great question. I mean, every camp had poetry clubs and groups, and they all had internal newspapers too. So a lot of it, I think there would be a Japanese section, like in Japanese, and then an English section. So they would contribute poems. After the war, there was still this very robust Japanese language press. And so my grandmother especially contributed a lot of poetry. So yes, it was going on in every camp. You can read about it. And when you go to those individual newspapers, you can see it. Ari might know more about scholarship, but I know that I've been in touch with a Japanese professor at Brigham Young who is working on translations. We have really been gratified to meet Yonsei, fourth generation, who are poets or working on their family's history, and sometimes it involves poetry too. I do think that it's an area that needs to be studied more and that we'll see more and more. I think Ari can speak to maybe the dearth of the people with the language abilities, right? To
Yeah.
do that scholarship.
Yeah, maybe I could
You wanna come
come
up
up. No, you can stay there. Sorry, I'm all stiff from sitting. Let's see. One of there were a lot of questions in that one question. But about was there? I think the questioner. I heard a question in there about how this type of material is viewed in Japan, right? I think that was part of the question. And well, unfortunately, it hasn't been viewed much at all, or evaluated. I think that there's a lot of reasons for that. Some good reasons, some really not very good reasons. So that I think those who are interested, that the people like Teruko Kume, who did the Senryu study, it's the Japanese scholars who are interested, who enter this not so much through poetry, but through their study, their interest in American history. Okay, and that chapter of American history, and then they discover and then they move forward with it. And there's also although it's changing now, thank goodness, and I'm looking forward to much more. But in this country, the sort of the more typical traditional folks who study Japanese literature, they weren't interested because these are written, after all, by amateurs. You know, we're not talking about like a lost haiku manuscript by the great master Basho, right? That, you know, that would get tremendous attention. And I think this sort of thing really challenges our notions of what poetry is and what poets are. As Monica mentioned, it is. There are people who view it as a pastime. It's kind of like, you know, kind of like a hobby. So, you know, people come and go, but there are those who are truly devoted to it. And remember, the word amateur means those who love the subject. And some of the poems are, you know, written by these so-called amateurs are really good. But there's still kind of oh, it's not worth studying. That sort of attitude, you know, unfortunately. So I think though the work of the Issei, I think the other part of the appeal about that body of work is that it also tells us a lot about you know, historically, as part of, you know, incarceration, how they felt about that. So I don't know if that answers the question, but okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. There's several questions in the Zoom chat, unless someone in the in-person audience would like to ask a question. Here's a question. What are some recommendations as to how to go about starting the process to collect this type of valuable cultural and familial history knowledge? Do you have any suggestions or recommendation as to what are the different ways we can go about collecting familial knowledge, especially as you had mentioned, the language barriers? How do you feel you stay grounded in your cultural background in your everyday life?
I think something that you hear all the time in the Japanese community is, I wish I had asked more questions when my grandparents were alive. And this is a really universal thing. You know, when you're a teenager and you're so self-involved, you're not exactly thinking about what your grandparents went through. And it's only later, as a much more mature adult, that you think, wow, you know, they're gone now and it's too late. I mean, my father was sent to the roughest, most violent camp because his two members of his family were no-no boys. In other words, they refused to sign the loyalty oath. And he was a 13-year-old kid kind of on his own. And I'm dying to know what that experience was like, but he never spoke about it and I didn't ask him. So I would say number one is, if you have living immigrant grandparents or great grandparents, whatever, that first generation who came over, to definitely ask a lot of questions, do videotape interviews. My brother did some of that with my grandmother. Really find out as much as you can, because it's really a gold mine when you think today, if we had those kinds of I think of questions all the time I wish I had asked my grandparents. So ask them, try to learn the language if you don't speak it, try to collect any material, whether it's letters or diaries that they have left behind, so they don't get thrown away or lost. Photo albums. We met a really wonderful researcher in Heart Mountain who is working on trying to get all the photos taken at Heart Mountain. And with kind of today's data technology, you know, you could really maybe figure out who people are in all of these anonymous photo albums that grandparents left, that we think, well, we have no idea who all these people are. Well, maybe one day we'll be able to figure it out. So I would say, you know, don't throw things away. Try to learn the language. And then really, I think there's so much value in collaborating and crowdsourcing and talking to other similar like-minded groups. I'd love to see a conference on people who are doing this, Issei, fiction, poetry, and just the amount that you could share and learn from each other would be really, really exciting. So I don't know, what about everyone else? Can you, any tips, suggestions?
Oh, God. You know, I think Nancy spoke very beautifully. I was also intrigued by that question about how does one stay grounded in one's culture. It's something I also asked myself. So I'm one of the Shin Issei, and I don't feel fully Japanese anymore. I don't feel fully American, and so um, I think, as Nancy mentioned, collaborating has been a really wonderful, fulfilling, enriching, and also most empowering experience for me. I also teach Japanese literature, though that is not my expertise. My PhD was in, American literature in English, but being able to teach Japanese literature to students has helped me maintain that tie to Japan. So I think there's a way to find, a means to stay grounded, whether one is an immigrant or not, So I love that question. So thank you very much, whoever you are in the Zoom audience.
Wonderful question, and I'm really happy people are thinking about these things.
Not fully Japanese, not fully American, but actually I would categorize that as fully both. Fully both. Okay.
I think we are out of time. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, and thank you all, the audience, for your questions. And we have 12 books to give away, so I think we have enough for all the students in the room. So if you'd like a copy of the book, feel free to get a copy.
Thank you for being a wonderful audience.